In the pre-dawn darkness of January 3, 2026, Caracas did not sleep. Just after 2 a.m., explosions echoed through the Venezuelan capital. Something unprecedented was unfolding. Low-flying aircraft, flashes in the distance, and the most powerful foreign military force in the world chipping away at the sovereignty of a nation, just as headlines around the globe lit up with shock. In a matter of hours, Nicolás Maduro, the man who had led Venezuela for more than a decade, was out of his country, held by the United States. The world watched with disbelief. This was history in motion. Tonight, we tell that history. Nicolás Maduro Moro's story is not one of privilege or power from birth. He emerged from the working-class barrios of Caracas years after his mentor, Hugo Chávez, sparked a revolution that would reshape Venezuela. Maduro was once a bus driver and union organizer, a figure on the margins who learned early on how politics works, not inside luxurious halls, but in crowded back rooms and public squares. Through loyalty, discipline, and an instinct for survival, Maduro climbed. He represented the Bolivarian movement overseas, becoming a trusted lieutenant of Chávez and later vice president. When Chávez died in 2013, Maduro inherited a nation already cracking under economic strain, institutional decay, and growing public discontent. For years, Nicolás Maduro insisted on calling himself a president. In practice, he ruled as a dictator. Power in Venezuela no longer flowed through institutions, it flowed through him. Elections continued to exist, but their outcomes were decided long before ballots were counted. Opposition parties were disqualified, their leaders jailed, exiled, or stripped of political rights. Courts answered to the executive, the legislature was bypassed or neutralized. The armed forces were rewarded not for professionalism, but for loyalty. When Venezuelans took to the streets to protest hunger, blackouts, and collapsing hospitals, the response was not dialogue, it was force. Security forces fired tear gas, rubber bullets, and at times live ammunition. Hundreds were killed over the years, thousands were detained, many were tortured. The message was simple and consistent: dissent would be punished. Maduro governed through fear and dependency. Food became a political weapon. Government-controlled food boxes were distributed only to those registered as supporters of the regime. Speaking out meant risking not just arrest, but access to basic necessities. Survival itself became conditional. Under his rule, a nation with the largest proven oil reserves in the world collapsed into poverty. Hyperinflation erased salaries overnight. Savings became meaningless. Parents skipped meals so their children could eat. Doctors operated without electricity or running water. Entire professions vanished as millions fled the country, creating the largest migration crisis in the history of the Americas. This was not the result of war or natural disaster. It was the consequence of authoritarian control, corruption, and economic mismanagement enforced at gunpoint. Maduro did not merely preside over Venezuela's decline, he enforced it, and he did so with an iron grip, convinced that holding power mattered more than the lives unraveling beneath it. Elections continued, but their legitimacy was questioned. Institutions bent toward executive control, protests met with crackdowns, relations with the United States, long strained under Chávez, deteriorated further as accusations of corruption and human rights abuses mounted. By mid-2025, the tensions between Washington and Caracas had become extraordinary. The Trump administration, asserting Venezuela as a direct threat due to alleged ties between Maduro's government and international drug trafficking, had designated elements of the Venezuelan state as terrorist actors and offered up to $50 million for information leading to Maduro's capture. In the latter half of 2025, the United States began a military pressure. U.S. forces carried out repeated attacks on maritime targets in Caribbean waters, asserting they were striking drug trafficking operations. These strikes killed dozens, according to independent reporting, although the evidence tying those vessels to drugs was contested. Yet even as military steam built, there were diplomatic signals from Caracas. In early January, Maduro declared Venezuela willing to negotiate with the United States on issues like oil cooperation and migration if there was serious dialogue and respect for Venezuelan sovereignty, a statement that played out just days before the dramatic military strike. The scene was set for an explosive collision, both literally and politically. At roughly 02:01 local time on January 3, 2026, the United States launched what it would later call Operation Absolute Resolve. Explosions were heard in Caracas, La Guaira, and surrounding areas. Reports cited at least 7 detonations and multiple aircraft in low flight over the capital's airspace. In his first public comment on the operation, U.S. President Donald Trump claimed Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, had been captured during a large-scale strike and taken out of the country. Trump said the U.S. would run Venezuela until there is a safe transition, emphasizing that Washington saw this as necessary to restore stability. American media reported declarations that U.S. oil companies would help rebuild and operate Venezuela's oil industry, and claimed the strike followed months of planning under Trump's orders. Globally, reactions were immediate and explosive. Russia and China both denounced the operation as aggressive intervention. The fall of Nicolás Maduro immediately set off alarm bells across Latin America, especially among countries governed by radical left-wing movements or coalitions that maintain a strongly anti-American stance. Brazilian President Inácio Lula said the U.S. had crossed an unacceptable line, violating Venezuelan sovereignty and setting a dangerous international precedent. Colombia and other neighbors expressed deep concern, mobilizing border contingency plans. For these governments, the U.S. intervention in Venezuela was not seen only as the end of a dictatorship, but a dangerous precedent, creating fears that Washington might decide to apply similar logic elsewhere, under the banner of restoring democracy, fighting drug trafficking, or protecting strategic interests. The idea that an American president could capture a foreign head of state, announce a temporary administration of that country, and open its natural resources to U.S. companies caused deep unease. Even governments that were not aligned with Caracas expressed concern about a new era of interventionism in which national sovereignty could become conditional when confronted with geopolitical, energetic, or security interests defined outside the region. That fear reinforced calls for regional solidarity, stronger Latin American integration, and efforts to diversify alliances with powers like China and Russia, not only out of ideological affinity, but for political self-preservation. The message many governments took away was clear: the balance of power in the hemisphere had shifted, and from that moment on, no country could ignore that internal crises might be treated as international matters, with consequences that remain deeply unpredictable. European leaders called for calm and respect for international law, while others expressed cautious support but urged adherence to the UN Charter. Domestically in Venezuela, division was suddenly public. Opposition figures celebrated Maduro's capture as a historic moment, calling it a chance for democratic renewal, while members of the regime denounced it as imperialist aggression. Some viewed the move as liberation from authoritarian rule. Others saw it as a dangerous replay of historical foreign interventions, with unpredictable long-term consequences. Critics in the United States and abroad have pointed to massive legal and constitutional issues surrounding the operation. Questions remain about whether the U.S. president had the authority to order a military strike and capture a sitting head of state without congressional approval, and whether Venezuela's sovereignty was lawfully violated under international norms. Maduro, now facing U.S. criminal charges, including narcotics charges stemming from a 2020 indictment, is slated to be tried in New York. Whether such a trial will proceed under full due process or whether it will further inflame Venezuelan nationalism and regional tensions remains uncertain. The United States has signaled it will assume temporary governance until a safe transition occurs, even as Venezuelan officials, including Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, reject the U.S. claims and maintain Maduro's legitimacy. Opposition leaders, emboldened abroad after years in exile, claim they stand ready to lead a transitional government. Yet the scars run deep. Venezuelans inside and outside the country watch with apprehension, uncertain if foreign intervention means real change or yet another power vacuum exploited by stronger interests. Regional stability is shaken, with neighbors worried about spillover in migration, economics, and security. Global powers are recalibrating alliances and strategies, watching whether this moment signals a new era of U.S. interventionism or an isolated, controversial act. Nicolás Maduro's life now hangs between the courtroom and history books, no longer presiding over a nation in crisis, but himself a prisoner of international justice. Whether Venezuela emerges with renewed democratic integrity, collapses further into fractured warlord states, or becomes a battleground for geopolitical chess remains unwritten. What is certain is this. The capture of Maduro was not merely the fall of one man. It was a turning point that forces the Americas and indeed the world to confront hard questions. What does sovereignty mean in an age of global intervention? Can a nation truly rebuild after its institutions have been hollowed out? And who gets to decide the future of a people who have endured so much? History will record this moment in stark contrast between the end of an era and the beginning of a perilous next chapter. The world watches. The future is unresolved. And Venezuela, once again, stands at the threshold of possibility and peril. What happens next will not affect Venezuela alone. It will shape migration across the Americas, energy markets around the world, and the future of how power is challenged and removed in the 21st century. History is watching, and so are we. If you want to understand what comes next, if you believe these stories matter, and if you don't want to miss the next chapter of this unfolding global shift, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us. Because this story isn't over, and the consequences will reach far beyond Venezuela.